The camera is shaking, the image blurry before it finally focuses on a piece of paper, an official-looking document taped crudely to a wooden door. We hear a gasp, a choked sob, and then Jenny's voice, thin and reedy with panic. "They're throwing us out," she whispers, her words cracking under the weight of disbelief. The phone camera zooms in, the text of an eviction order swimming into focus. His own parents are making us homeless. We have 30 days. That single desperate Instagram story was the spark that ignited a firestorm across the entire 90-day Fiance universe. For years, we watched Jenny and Sumit fight for their love, for their right to exist as a couple against the relentless tide of his family's disapproval. Their home, we were led to believe, was a sanctuary, a fragile bubble of peace carved out of a war zone of familial judgment. That illusion has just been shattered with the force of a battering ram. If you are tired of the sanitized stories and want the explosive, behind-the-scenes truth that is far more shocking than anything you'll see on television, then you need to hit that subscribe button right now. Ring that notification bell, because you are not going to want to miss a single second of the bombshells we are about to drop. This isn't just a story, it's the final chapter in a long, dark conspiracy. The initial reaction from the community was predictable, a tidal wave of sympathy for Jenny and Sumit and a torrent of outrage directed squarely at Sadhna and Anil. The comments poured in by the thousands. "Sadhna is a monster. After everything they've been through, they do this?" I knew his parents were evil, but this is a new low. The consensus was simple and damning. Sumit's parents, in a final act of spite, were kicking their son and his wife out of a family-owned property, likely to punish them for their marriage once and for all. It was a narrative that fit perfectly with everything we'd ever seen. It was cruel, it was petty, and it felt like the inevitable, ugly culmination of a decade of conflict. Sumit's family, through unofficial channels and whispers to distant relatives that conveniently made their way to online blogs, began to push their own version of events. It was a carefully crafted narrative designed to paint them not as villains, but as long-suffering, benevolent parents who had finally reached their limit. The house, their story went, was never meant to be a permanent home for the couple. It was an investment property, a financial asset that they had graciously, out of the goodness of their hearts, allowed Sumit and Jenny to live in for years, rent-free. They had provided a roof over their heads when no one else would. But now, they claimed, circumstances had changed. They needed to liquidate assets for their retirement, to secure their own future. It was a difficult but necessary business decision. They had given their son years to get on his feet, and now it was simply time to sell. They wished the couple well in finding a new place to live. It was a story that was cold, corporate, and devoid of emotion, yet it was plausible enough to sow a seed of doubt in a small corner of the internet. But that story, that clean, sterile, business-like explanation, was a lie, a monstrous, calculated lie, designed to cover up a crime so profound it would make every other transgression they had ever committed seem like a childish prank. The truth was infinitely more criminal, a tangled web of greed, forgery, and the ultimate familial betrayal. And it was about to be exposed by a voice from the past, a ghost from the family's history who had remained silent for years, watching this injustice fester. A new insider, a source far more credible and intimately connected to the family's deepest secrets, came forward. This wasn't some disgruntled cousin or a friend of a friend. This individual claimed to be the former longtime personal assistant to Sumit's late grandfather, the patriarch of the family. And the story they told didn't just change the narrative, it obliterated it. It revealed that the eviction wasn't an act of spite. It was an act of pure, unadulterated desperation, the final frantic move in a long con designed to steal Sumit's birthright and render him completely dependent on his parents forever. To understand the sheer magnitude of this deception, we have to go back in time, to the final years of Sumit's grandfather's life. The family patriarch was a man of the old world, a traditionalist in many ways, but he was also, according to the assistant, a man of profound wisdom and perception. While the rest of the family, led by the vocal and domineering Sadhna, saw Sumit's love for Jenny as a source of shame, a rebellion against culture and tradition, the grandfather saw something else entirely. He saw courage. He saw a young man willing to sacrifice everything, his reputation, his standing in the community, his relationship with his own parents, for a love that was genuine and true. He secretly admired Sumit. He saw in his grandson a strength of character that his other children and grandchildren lacked. He saw that Sumit's defiance wasn't born of disrespect. but of a deep, unshakable conviction. And he saw Jenny not as a foreign invader, but as the source of his grandson's happiness and strength. He recognized the authenticity of their bond, a bond that transcended age, culture, and the petty judgments of those around them. The assistant revealed that in his final months, the grandfather was deeply troubled. He worried constantly about Sumit's future. He knew that as long as Sumit was financially dependent on Sadhna and Anil, he would never be truly free. His parents would forever hold his financial insecurity over his head, using it as a weapon to manipulate him, to control his life, and to try and break his spirit and his marriage. The grandfather was determined not to let that happen. He wanted to give Sumit the one thing his parents would always deny him: independence. So, he made a secret plan. Working with his most trusted lawyer and his personal assistant, he made a decision that would change everything. He decided to gift Sumit the very house that he and Jenny would one day call their sanctuary. It wasn't just a house, it was a substantial asset, located in a desirable neighborhood with a market value estimated today at over $300,000. This property, the grandfather decreed, would belong to Sumit and Sumit alone. It would be his foundation, his security, a place where he and Jenny could build a life, safe from the storms of family disapproval. Knowing his own son and daughter-in-law, knowing their greed and their obsessive need for control, the grandfather took extraordinary measures to protect this gift. He created a secret, legally binding will, a document completely separate from his main estate. This codicil specifically and unequivocally bequeathed the property directly to Sumit Singh, effective upon his death. It was ironclad, witnessed, and notarized. It was his final, loving act of rebellion on his grandson's behalf. The assistant claims the day it was signed, the old man was peaceful for the first time in months. He felt he had finally secured his grandson's happiness, but a secret is only a secret until it is found. Upon the grandfather's death, as Sadhna and Anil took control of his affairs, exercising their power of attorney over his estate, they made a shocking discovery. Tucked away in a private safe, they found the secret will. The assistant described the scene as one of pure, unadulterated horror, not of grief, but of rage. They read the document, and the color drained from their faces. Their father had gone behind their backs. He had given Sumit, the defiant, shameful son, a massive financial windfall. He had given him freedom. He had given him power. In their twisted view, this wasn't a gift. It was a betrayal. It was a direct challenge to their authority. If Sumit owned this house, he wouldn't need them anymore. He wouldn't have to beg for their approval. He and that American woman could live comfortably, independently, for the rest of their lives. The very thought was intolerable. It would mean they had lost. And so, in that moment, a criminal conspiracy was born. They knew they couldn't just destroy the will. The lawyer who drafted it was still alive, and the assistant knew of its existence. They needed to make it disappear in a more permanent legal way. Their minds, poisoned by greed and a desperate need for control, turned to fraud. Using their power of attorney over the grandfather's estate, a power that was meant to be used to execute his wishes, they committed the ultimate breach of fiduciary duty. They went to a different lawyer, a less scrupulous one, and with the original deed to the house in their possession, they forged a new one. They created a fraudulent document, a falsified property deed that transferred the ownership of the house from the grandfather's estate directly into their own names, Sadhna and Anil Singh. They backdated documents, forged signatures, and paid whatever fees were necessary to have it officially recorded. To the outside world, it looked like a standard legal transfer of property within a family. But it was a crime. It was the theft of an inheritance. They took the secret will and buried it, confident that their secret was safe. With the stolen house now legally, at least on paper, in their name, they began the second phase of their plan, the long con. They approached Sumit and Jenny with a magnificent, magnanimous offer. They told them they knew they were struggling, and while they still didn't approve of their marriage, they were willing, as parents, to offer an olive branch. They would allow them to live in their investment property for a while. They framed it as an act of incredible generosity, a gesture of goodwill. And Sumit, who had no reason to suspect otherwise, was overwhelmed with gratitude. He believed his parents were finally, slowly, coming around. He felt perpetually indebted to them. For years, this charade continued. Every family argument, every disagreement was subtly underscored by the fact that Jenny and Sumit were living under Sadhna and Anil's roof. Their generosity was a weapon, a constant, unspoken reminder of who held the power. They made their own son feel like a guest in his own home, a tenant living on the charity of his parents, all while knowing that he was the rightful owner. It was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation, designed to keep Sumit broken, dependent, and eternally grateful for the scraps they threw him. So why, after all these years of careful, cruel manipulation, would they suddenly blow it all up? Why evict them now and risk exposing the entire scheme? The answer, as the insider revealed, lies with the other son, the golden child, Amit. While Sumit was building a life of quiet defiance, Amit was apparently a catastrophic failure in business. He had launched an ambitious new venture, funded by a series of increasingly risky loans, and it had imploded in spectacular fashion. He was facing financial ruin, on the hook to creditors for an enormous sum of money. He was desperate. He went to his parents begging for a bailout. Sadhna and Anil, who had always favored Amit, couldn't bear to see their preferred son fail so publicly. They had to save him, but they didn't have that kind of cash on hand. What they did have, however, was a major asset that appeared to be legally theirs, a house valued at over $300,000. The house Sumit and Jenny were living in. In a move of staggering recklessness, they went to a bank and, using the forged deed as proof of ownership, took out a massive loan against the property's equity. They mortgaged their son's stolen inheritance to its absolute limit. The bank, seeing a clean title and a legitimate-looking deed, approved the loan. The money was wired, and Amit's immediate debts were paid. Sadhna and Anil believed they had solved the problem. They had saved their favorite son using an asset that, in their minds, they were entitled to control. But the reprieve was short-lived. The bailout wasn't enough. Amit's business was a sinking ship, and the money they had given him was just a bucket of water thrown into the ocean. The business collapsed completely, and the loan payments to the bank stopped. The default notices started arriving. The bank, patient at first, soon lost its patience. The letters became demands, and finally, the bank called in the loan. The full massive debt was due immediately. Sadhna and Anil were trapped. They didn't have the money to pay it back. Their only option, the only way to satisfy the bank and avoid a catastrophic lawsuit and foreclosure, was to sell the collateral. They had to sell the house. And to do that, they had to get the current occupants out. The eviction notice wasn't a punishment for Sumit's marriage. It was a desperate, panicked attempt to liquidate a stolen asset to cover up a different financial crime. They were evicting their own son from his rightful home, making him homeless, in a last-ditch effort to save his brother from the consequences of his own failure. The ultimate betrayal was now complete. They were prepared to sacrifice one son to save the other, destroying Sumit's life to clean up Amit's mess. The moment that eviction notice was nailed to the door, a clock started ticking. For Jenny and Sumit, the initial shock gave way to a profound, soul-crushing despair. They were being rendered homeless by the very people who were supposed to protect them. The world they had built, their one safe harbor, was being ripped away. They packed boxes in a daze, the weight of defeat heavy in the air. But as the days passed, something shifted. Despair began to curdle into anger. Sumit, who had spent a lifetime trying to win his parents' approval, finally realized that their approval was a poisoned chalice. This act was so monstrous, so far beyond the pale of normal family dysfunction, that it severed the final thread of filial obligation. He wasn't just being kicked out, he was being erased, and he decided he would not be erased quietly. They decided to fight, not just the eviction, but the injustice of it all. They scraped together what money they had and found a young, hungry lawyer who was willing to take on their case, initially just to delay the eviction and buy them some time. The first court hearing was a brutal, humiliating affair. It was a simple eviction proceeding in a crowded, impersonal courtroom. Sadhna and Anil didn't even bother to show up. They sent their slick, expensive lawyer. He presented the deed of ownership, the forged one, to the judge. It looked official, with all the requisite stamps and signatures. He painted a picture of his clients as generous landlords who had simply decided to sell their property. On paper, their case was airtight. Sumit and Jenny's lawyer could do little more than argue for a continuance, citing procedural errors and asking for more time to prepare a defense. The judge, seeing a straightforward landlord-tenant dispute, reluctantly granted them a few more weeks. For Sadhna and Anil, it was a minor delay. Victory, they believed, was inevitable. They left the courthouse feeling confident, even smug, but their confidence was about to be shattered because their crime had not gone unnoticed. The grandfather's former assistant, the keeper of his secrets, had been following the news. They had seen Jenny's frantic Instagram post and had heard the family's sanitized public explanation. And they knew it was all a lie, For years, they had honored their former employer's memory by staying silent, not wanting to ignite a war within the family. But this was a desecration of the old man's final wishes. Evicting Sumit from the very home his grandfather had gifted him for his protection was a line that could not be crossed. The assistant made a phone call. The meeting with Sumit's lawyer was a clandestine affair, held in a quiet coffee shop far from the family's neighborhood. The assistant laid out the entire story, from the grandfather's secret admiration for Jenny and Sumit to the creation of the hidden will, the parents' discovery of it, and the subsequent forgery. Sumit's lawyer listened, first with skepticism, then with wide-eyed astonishment. It sounded like the plot of a movie, but the assistant had brought more than just a story. They had brought proof. They explained that the grandfather, paranoid about his family's interference, had taken one final extraordinary precaution. He didn't just write a will, he recorded one. The assistant slid a small, unassuming flash drive across the table. On that drive, they explained, was a video. A video of the grandfather, recorded just weeks before he died, explaining his gift, his reasons, and his love for Sumit. It was the smoking gun. The lawyer's demeanor changed instantly. The fight was no longer about delaying an eviction. It was about exposing a massive multi-year fraud. They immediately filed a countersuit, and the case was escalated from a lowly housing court to a full-blown fraud trial in a superior court. The legal battle had begun in earnest. The allegations were explosive. First, real estate fraud and forgery, knowingly and with intent to deceive, falsifying a legal deed of ownership for the purpose of illicit financial gain. Second, fraudulent concealment, the deliberate act of hiding a legal and binding will to disinherit the rightful heir, a crime that strikes at the very heart of estate law. And third, breach of fiduciary duty, a grievous abuse of their power of attorney, using the authority granted to them to settle the grandfather's estate to instead enrich themselves and defraud another beneficiary. The trial was a media circus. News vans camped outside the courthouse. 90-Day Fiance bloggers and YouTubers filled the gallery, live tweeting every development. Sadhna, Anil, and Amit were now forced to appear in person, their faces grim masks of indignation. Their legal team came out swinging, presenting the forged deed as their Exhibit A. It was, they argued, a clear-cut case of ownership. They called Sadhna to the stand. She was a master performer. She wept, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief, as she told the court how she had loved her son, how she had only ever wanted to protect him from a poor life choice. She claimed the house was a family asset, and the transfer of the deed into her and Anil's name was a simple estate planning maneuver, done with her late father-in-law's full knowledge and blessing. She portrayed herself as the victim, a mother whose generosity was now being twisted and used against her in a court of law by her ungrateful son and his manipulative foreign wife. It was a compelling performance, and for a moment, a shadow of doubt fell over the courtroom. Then it was Sumit's turn. His lawyer began not by calling Sumit to the stand, but by calling the grandfather's former assistant. The assistant, poised and professional, walked the court through the entire conspiracy. They spoke of the grandfather's wishes, of the secret will, and of the moment they knew, with sickening certainty, that Sadhna and Anil had found it and hidden it. The parents' lawyer fought back hard on cross-examination, trying to paint the assistant as a disgruntled former employee with a grudge. But the assistant's testimony was unshakable, their credibility absolute. And then came the moment the entire 90-day community had been waiting for. Sumit's lawyer announced they had one final piece of evidence to present. A large television monitor was wheeled to the front of the courtroom. The lights were dimmed. "We would like to play for the court," the lawyer said, his voice echoing in the silent room. "A video will, recorded by the late Mr. Singh." A collective gasp went through the gallery. On the screen, the face of Sumit's grandfather appeared. He looked frail, but his eyes were clear and determined. He spoke directly to the camera, as if he were in the room itself. His voice was warm, filled with an emotion that a written document could never convey. He spoke of his love for his grandson, Sumit. He praised his courage, his loyalty, his capacity for love. And then, looking directly into the lens, he spoke of Jenny. He called her a good woman, a woman who had brought his grandson a happiness he had never known. "This is why," the grandfather said, his voice steady, "I have left my house on Amrapali Road to Sumit. It is his, and his alone. It is my gift to him and his wife, a place for them to be safe." He paused, and his expression hardened slightly. "I know my son Anil and his wife Sadhna. I know they will not like this. They may try to interfere with my final wishes. They may try to take what is not theirs. Sumit, my boy, if you are seeing this, it is because they have tried. Do not let them. This house is your birthright. The video ended. The courtroom was in stunned silence. Sadhna was ashen-faced, her eyes wide with terror. Anil seemed to have shrunk in his chair. The judge stared at the blank screen for a long moment before turning his gaze, cold as steel, toward them. But Sumit's lawyer wasn't finished. They called their final witness, a court-appointed forensic document expert. The expert placed the forged deed and a sample of the grandfather's verified signature under a projector. He then delivered a clinical, devastatingly precise execution. He pointed out the inconsistencies in the pen pressure, the hesitation marks in the loops of the letters, the microscopic differences in the slant. The signatures on this deed, the expert concluded, looking directly at the jury, are not just forgeries, they are blatant, almost amateurish forgeries. There is zero possibility that they were written by the same hand. It was over. The lie, so carefully constructed and maintained for years, had been utterly and completely demolished. The judge's verdict was not just a legal ruling, it was a condemnation, delivered with a swift and merciless fury. He stood, his voice thundering through the courtroom, and addressed Sadhna and Anil directly. He declared the forged property deed to be null and void, a fraudulent document with no legal standing whatsoever. In the same breath, he officially validated the grandfather's secret will and the accompanying video statement, declaring it to be the true and final testament regarding the property. He slammed his gavel, and with that single sharp crack, Sumit was declared the undisputed legal owner of his home. The eviction case was contemptuously thrown out, but the judge was far from finished. He announced that he was referring Sadhna, Anil, and their son Amit, who was implicated in the subsequent bank loan, to the district attorney's office for a full criminal investigation. The charges he recommended were severe: forgery, a felony in itself, perjury, for lying under oath on the witness stand, and conspiracy to commit bank fraud, for using a fraudulent document to secure a loan. He looked down at them from his bench, his face a mask of disgust. "This court has seen many family disputes," he said, his voice dripping with scorn. "But this level of calculated, cruel deception against one's own child is frankly shocking. You have not only broken the law, you have grotesquely perverted the very meaning of family." The fallout was immediate and catastrophic for the Singhs. The victory for Jenny and Sumit was absolute. Not only did they keep their home, but the court also ordered Sadhna and Anil to pay for every single cent of Sumit and Jenny's legal fees. The judge didn't stop there. He tacked on an additional $150,000 in punitive damages, a monetary punishment specifically designed to make them pay for the years of emotional distress and calculated deception they had inflicted upon their son and daughter-in-law. The financial justice was as complete as the legal vindication. And then came the final humiliation. The bank, having learned in open court that the collateral for their massive loan was based on a forged deed, immediately filed their own multi-million-dollar lawsuit against Sadhna, Anil, and Amit for providing fraudulent collateral. Their desperate attempt to make Sumit homeless had not only failed, but it had left them in complete financial ruin, facing staggering civil liabilities and the very real possibility of prison time. They were now legally barred from the very property they had tried to steal, a property that stood as a monument to their greed and their downfall. For Jenny and Sumit, the long nightmare was over. They stood on the steps of the courthouse, not just as victors in a legal battle, but as survivors of a war they never should have had to fight. Sumit had finally received what he had craved his entire life: validation and unconditional love from a respected family elder. It had come from beyond the grave, a final gift from a wise old man who saw the truth all along. Their home was no longer a sanctuary held at the whim of his parents. It was a fortress, built on a foundation of truth and bequeathed by love. They had been to the brink, pushed to the very edge of homelessness and despair, only to emerge stronger, more united, and finally, truly free. Sumit's parents tried to make him and Jenny homeless just to save his brother. In your opinion, what's a worse betrayal? Stealing your son's inheritance or faking a secret grandchild? Let me know which crime is worse in the comments below. The victory in the courtroom was not a joyous explosion of relief. It was a quiet, deep, shuddering exhale, the kind you take after surviving something you were certain would kill you. As Jenny and Sumit stepped out of the courthouse and into the harsh Indian sunlight, blinking against the flashbulbs of the assembled media, they were not just a couple who had won a lawsuit. They were two people who had been pulled back from the edge of an abyss. The legal jargon, the judge's rulings, the monetary damages, all of it faded into the background, replaced by a single, overwhelming reality. They were safe. Their home was theirs. The war, the long, grueling, soul-destroying war against Sumit's family, was finally over, and they had won. While they were processing their new reality, the 90-day fiancé community was processing it for them, and the reaction was biblical in its scope and fury. The Schadenfreude was a tidal wave. The internet, which had once been a forum for debating their age gap, became a digital tribunal passing judgment on Sadhna, Anil, and Amit. Memes went viral overnight. Sadhna's crying face from the witness stand photoshopped onto a world's worst mom coffee mug. Anil's grimace next to the definition of the word forgery. Fan-made video edits, once dedicated to Jenny and Sumit's most romantic moments, were now recut as triumphant anthems, intersplicing clips of the grandfather's video with footage of Sadhna looking furious, all set to songs like Another One Bites the Dust. The story was no longer about a controversial relationship. It was a modern-day fable of good versus evil, of a stolen birthright reclaimed, of villains getting their spectacular comeuppance. Every blogger, every podcaster, every YouTuber in the 90-day universe dedicated hours of content to dissecting the Singh family's downfall. They were no longer just disapproving parents. They were branded for what they were, criminals. For Sadhna and Anil, the drive home from the courthouse was a journey through the ruins of their own lives. The silence in the car was heavier than any argument they had ever had. There were no tears, no recriminations, just the dead, hollow emptiness of total defeat. They had played the ultimate game, wagered everything on their perceived power and authority, and had lost in the most public and humiliating way imaginable. But the public humiliation was only the beginning. Their social world, the carefully constructed ecosystem of respectability and status they had spent a lifetime building, evaporated in less than a week. The whispers started immediately. At the local market, friends of 30 years would suddenly find something fascinating to look at on a distant shelf when they approached. Invitations to weddings and religious festivals, once a given, simply stopped arriving. Sadhna, a woman who thrived on being the center of her social circle, a purveyor of gossip and judgment, was now the subject of it. She was a pariah. She could feel the stares on her back, hear the hushed conversations that would cease the moment she entered a room. They were no longer the respected Singh family. They were the family who tried to make their own son homeless. They were the forgers. They were the thieves. Their name, once a source of pride, was now a stain. While their social standing crumbled, their financial world was being systematically dismantled by the dual forces of the court order and the bank's lawsuit. The court's judgment was the first blow. The order to pay Sumit and Jenny's legal fees, plus the $150,000 in punitive damages, was not a suggestion. It was a legally enforceable debt. Their bank accounts were frozen. Liens were placed on their own home and any other assets they possessed. But that was a flesh wound compared to the mortal blow delivered by the bank. The bank's lawyers were not interested in family drama or excuses. They were interested in their money. They sued Sadhna, Anil, and Amit for the full amount of the fraudulent loan, plus interest, penalties, and their own massive legal costs. The lawsuit was a foregone conclusion. The evidence of fraud had been proven in open court. The Singhs had no defense. They were forced to liquidate everything. The retirement funds they had claimed they needed to protect were wiped out. Their own home, the seat of their power and judgment for so many years, was put on the market in a forced sale. They went from being the wealthy, benevolent landlords to being on the verge of homelessness themselves, a poetic justice so perfect it could have been scripted. For Sumit, however, there was one more ghost to confront. The betrayal by his parents was a familiar pain, a chronic ache he had lived with for years. But the betrayal by his brother Amit was a fresh, sharp wound. Amit, the golden child, the one for whom the entire criminal enterprise had been orchestrated. Amit, who had stood by silently and watched his parents try to destroy his own brother's life to save his skin. Sumit knew he had to face him. He found Amit not in a fine office or a bustling business, but in a small rented apartment, the last vestige of a life that had completely imploded. The confrontation was not loud or violent. It was quiet, which made it all the more devastating. Sumit didn't yell. He just asked, "Why?" Amit couldn't even look him in the eye. He mumbled excuses about business pressure, about not wanting to disappoint their parents, about how he thought it would all work out in the end. He tried to claim he didn't know the full extent of the plan, but Sumit saw through the lies. "You knew." Sumit said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. You knew the house was a gift from Grandpa, and you knew they were taking it from me to give to you. You stood there and let them try to make me and my wife homeless to pay for your mistakes. They stole my inheritance to cover your failure. In that moment, Amit wasn't his brother. He was just a weak, selfish man who had been complicit in a monstrous act. Sumit didn't wait for an apology. He knew a genuine one would never come. He just turned and walked away, severing the final tie to the family that had tried to break him. The door closed behind him, not just on an apartment, but on a lifetime of sibling rivalry and betrayal. Even in the face of absolute ruin, a narcissist like Sadhna does not know how to surrender. She couldn't comprehend a world in which she was not in control, in which she was not the victim. And so she launched one last desperate gambit, the apology tour. It began with frantic, tearful phone calls to Sumit. He didn't answer. The calls turned into a barrage of manipulative texts filled with pleas for forgiveness, declarations of a mother's undying love, and subtle accusations that he was tearing the family apart by refusing to speak to her. When that failed, she escalated. She showed up at their house. It was the ultimate power move, an attempt to breach the very fortress she had failed to conquer. But when she knocked on that door, it wasn't a broken, supplicating Sumit who answered. It was Jenny. Jenny stood in the doorway, not with anger, but with a calm, unshakable strength. She had spent a decade being judged, belittled, and dismissed by this woman. She had been made to feel like an intruder, a temporary problem that would eventually go away. Now she stood on the threshold of her own home, a home she had fought for and won, and she looked her tormentor in the eye. Sadhna began her rehearsed speech, her voice quivering with false emotion, talking about misunderstandings and a mother's misguided heart. Jenny let her speak for a moment before holding up a hand. There's nothing to misunderstand, Sadhna, she said, her voice steady. You tried to destroy our lives. You tried to make us homeless. This is our home now. You are not welcome here. The power dynamic had been irrevocably inverted. Jenny was no longer the outsider begging for acceptance. She was the gatekeeper. She was the protector of her home, her husband, and her peace. She closed the door, gently but firmly, in Sadhna's face, a final, definitive end to a toxic chapter. The legal system, meanwhile, continued its slow, inexorable grind. The district attorney's office, armed with the judge's referral and a mountain of evidence from the civil trial, formally filed criminal charges. Faced with the undeniable proof of the video will and the forensic expert's testimony, and staring down the barrel of a lengthy prison sentence if convicted by a jury, Sadhna, Anil, and Amit did the only thing they could. They took a plea deal. Their final appearance in court was a pathetic spectacle. There were no grand speeches, no tearful performances. They stood before a new judge, heads bowed, and pleaded guilty to lesser charges of conspiracy to commit fraud and filing a false instrument. The judge sentenced them to 5 years of probation, thousands of hours of community service, and a permanent criminal record that would follow them for the rest of their lives. For them, it was a life sentence of shame, a public branding that they could never escape. Back on Amrapali Road, life was beginning anew. The first thing Jenny and Sumit did with the punitive damages money was not to take a vacation or buy a fancy car. They held a small, private ceremony in their home. They framed a beautiful photo of Sumit's grandfather and placed it in the center of their living room. They lit incense, said a prayer of thanks, and Sumit spoke to his grandfather, telling him that his gift was safe, that his final wishes had been honored, and that his courage had given them their future. It was a moment of profound emotional closure. Then the real work began, the cleansing. They decided to symbolically and literally reclaim their space. The old, heavy furniture that reminded them of his parents' oppressive influence was sold or given away. They painted the walls in bright, warm colors. They went shopping together, laughing as they picked out new art, new rugs, a new dining table where they could build new, happy memories. The house was transformed. It was no longer a place of conditional charity, but a vibrant home that reflected their own tastes, their own personalities, their own love story. It was truly, finally, theirs. They also found their voices. No longer bound by a desire to appease his family, Sumit and Jenny began to speak their truth. They did interviews, but on their own terms. They told their story, not for fame or for drama, but as a cautionary tale about financial abuse and familial manipulation. They became advocates for other couples in similar cross-cultural struggles. Their story, a beacon of hope that you could fight back against injustice and win. Sumit, in particular, underwent a profound transformation. The weight of his parents' disapproval, a burden he had carried his entire life, was gone. In its place was a quiet confidence, a self-assurance born of surviving the ultimate trial by fire. He was no longer just Jenny's husband or Sadhna's son. He was Sumit Singh, a man who had stood up to his entire family, fought for his wife, and reclaimed his birthright. He had lost the family he was born into, but in doing so, he had solidified the family he had chosen. Their life settled into a new, peaceful rhythm. There were no more tearful, clandestine phone calls, no more dramatic showdowns, no more fear of a knock on the door. There was just the gentle hum of everyday life. They cooked together, watched movies, worked in their small garden. They were free. Free from judgment, free from manipulation, free from debt. The house stood as a symbol of their entire journey. Its foundation was a grandfather's love. Its walls were fortified by their resilience, and its rooms were now filled with the light and laughter of a love that had proven itself to be unbreakable. They had faced the worst betrayal a family could inflict, and had not only survived, but had emerged triumphant, whole, and more in love than ever. The eviction notice that had once seemed like an ending was, in fact, the beginning of their real life, a life of their own making, in a home they had truly earned. They were finally, completely home.